The Point Richmond History Association and the Richmond Public Library present Richmond's World War II housing, 23,000 units built and demolished. A wartime Richmond talk by Lester Ellis.
When my family arrived in Richmond, we were initially assigned an apartment in Canal War housing. Familiar with Canal War housing?
No.
Yeah, some of you for sure. And my mother enrolled us, my sister and me, in Washington Elementary School. So here, almost 80 years later, I'm back. Thank you very much for coming. What you're about to see and hear is my personal narrative about living in Richmond's World War II shipyard worker housing with my parents and younger sister for 7 years following the war. While we do that, we will also be learning about Richmond, California, a place that the World War II Congress, after the war, called the most war-impacted city in America. This, at times, is a personal story. Nonetheless, everything in the narrative has been very carefully researched. I attended elementary school and junior high in Richmond and graduated from Richmond High School. My wife Kim and I were married in St. Luke's Methodist Church on Barrett Avenue in 1961. And I started my business here in 1967. Except for the first 9 years, I have always lived in or relatively close. That's even better than a phone. Lived relatively close to Richmond, so I have witnessed its many changes over the years. So let's start. Okay. The 1940 National Census was the last one taken before World War II. At that time, the city of Oakland had a population of just over 300,000. The city of Berkeley had passed 83,000, and the city of Richmond had passed 23,000. Richmond was very much the little brother or little sister of the East Bay cities. In that 1940 census, Richmond's Chinese and Japanese residents, who we definitely know were here, were not mentioned for reasons I could not determine. For the first time, Hispanic residents were counted, and they were counted as white. The black population of Richmond in 1940 was 260 people. Richmond was obviously small compared to its neighboring communities, and was semi-rural, with some homes still having a cow and chickens in the backyard. But it was no backwater town. It had much to be proud of. In 1902, Standard Oil, now known as Chevron, opened its refinery, taking advantage of the deep water side of the fledgling city to receive raw material and ship its finished products from this location. It is still here, as it has now been for 120 years, and for decades has been the city's largest employer and most influential corporate citizen. Shortly before that, in 1899, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad was persuaded to make Richmond its western terminus, and in 1900, the first passenger train arrived from Chicago. To get its cars and passengers to San Francisco, Richmond and Santa Fe entered into an agreement that led to the digging of a railroad tunnel, still there, through the Point Richmond Ridge and to the building of a ferry terminal to carry Santa Fe's passengers and trains to San Francisco. Santa Fe stopped using the ferry in the 30s, and only the occasional barge used it in later years. In 1984, the structure caught fire, and what you see in this photo are the remains of the 120-year-old terminal. In 1905, the unincorporated area known as Richmond became the city of Richmond. Also in 1905, Mechanics Bank was established to serve the needs of the working class members of the Richmond community. In almost 120 years, it has successfully grown to 144 branches and 17 billion in assets. I worked at the main branch, pictured here, as a night bookkeeper while going to college. Possibly the most spectacular business to come to Richmond in its early years was wine haven. In 1907, a group of San Francisco wine investors built beautiful concrete and brick buildings on a lovely bayside cove. The purpose of the buildings was wine storage. Included in this construction was a company town comprising numerous worker cottages and a larger manager's home. Wine haven had its own wharf and 40 ships that carried wine around the globe. At the time, it was recognized as the largest winery in the world, here in Richmond. However, with passage of the Prohibition Act by Congress in 1917, the writing was on the wall and the owners eventually sold the property to avoid bankruptcy. The tens of thousands of bottles of wine still stored at Wine Haven had to be poured on the ground or into the bay. Of course, since these remarks were written originally, Point Melody, where Wine Haven is sited, has been sold to the East Bay Regional Park District, which is just a thrill to me because it means that these buildings will be preserved in some way.
Not everybody seems to think that anyway.
Well, I'll be out here lobbying for it. How's that? The wine anyway, the wine buildings and the little company town can still be found here on Stenmark Drive. In 1910, the Pullman Sleeper Car Company chose the city as a site to build a large network of buildings for the repair and refurbishing of its sleeper cars. The entire facility could service up to 30 cars at a time and was another major employer, providing jobs for over 525 workers.
Where was that?
It's off of
Carlson.
23rd, it's off of Carlson. Yeah, right, thank you.
Yeah, but that
Buildings.
That was black and white photo. Is there anything there today?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. That structure in the picture is still there.
Oh,
Yep, and a lot of others, but they won't let you go on the property. I tried to approach the guard to see if he would give me that right, and he said no. Also in 1910, the Carnegie Library opened after two of Richmond's women's clubs appealed to the Carnegie Corporation for a grant to build a city library. The city received a grant amounting to $530,000 in today's dollars, on the condition that the city maintain the structure after its completion. The library still stands, is now home to the Richmond Museum of History and Culture. A little footnote, the museum staff, especially research assistant Victoria Sturr, has been enormously helpful in finding information that has made this report possible. A year later, in 1911, the three-story brick Colonial Hotel opened on Railroad Avenue in Point Richmond. It had rooms and a restaurant and served diners and boarders, especially workers from the nearby Standard Oil refinery. Many years later, in the 30s, the hotel was bought by Mr. M.V. McAfee, a former manager of the luxury Claremont Hotel, and he changed the name to the Hotel Mac. It remains the Hotel Mac to this day and continues its long tradition of dining and hostelry. In 1926, another big event came to pass when the Richmond Natatorium opened, known to locals as the Plunge. It was a beautiful building that enclosed a large swimming pool with change rooms, showers, and waiting areas for those not swimming. I learned to swim there 20 years after it first opened. It too still stands, and in 2010 was restored to its full glory thanks to strong community support. Also in 1926, the beautiful Hotel Carquinez opened. It had a restaurant, bar, meeting rooms, and 4 stories of hotel rooms. Like the Hotel Mac, the Hotel Carquinez had a name change and became the Hotel Don. From the 20s to the 70s, it was the place where Richmond's movers and shakers gathered to conduct their off-the-agenda business. It is highly likely that meetings of those civic movers and shakers were held there to determine the fate of Harbor Gate and other World War II housing projects, our focus in just a few minutes. It is still actively used, almost 100 years after it first opened, but now as subsidized senior housing. The bar, restaurant, meeting rooms, and the movers and shakers are all gone.
Does anybody know what corner of that?
Can I ask you to save your questions to the end?
Well, I'm not gonna save a question like that, but yeah.
Okay, well, that's up to you. Also in 1926, whoops, that's the wrong one. In 1928, the city built Richmond Union High School on 23rd Street. It consisted of several beautiful brick buildings that I would attend 25 years later. Richmond High was a large school. It served 4 grades, sophomore, junior, and senior. In 1955, my graduating class was made up of 738 students, 41 of whom were black. The school I knew has since been torn down for earthquake safety reasons and a new school built in its place. A great loss in my opinion, and that of many of my fellow classmates. A little aside, the contract to build the school was awarded to the Overall Construction Company, founded by Norwegian immigrant Carl Overall in 1907. The company has been in Richmond for 114 years, is still family owned, and has over 400 employees. The company's oral history says they built a lot of school buildings during the war, but there is no record of which schools they worked on and whether or not they built Harbor Gate Elementary School. Very likely, but not with no certainty. In 1930, the Ford Motor Company decided to locate its assembly plant in Richmond, and it would be the largest such plant Ford built on the West Coast. In 1931, when the first car came off the assembly line, it was a shiny black Model A coupe. And it was given to the city of Richmond to be used as the city official's car. The car eventually went out of use, was parked and forgotten, and decades later, it was discovered sitting in a dusty corner of a city warehouse. A decision was made to fully restore the car, and it now has a central place in the Richmond Museum. Further industrial growth occurred in the 30s. The city brought in the Parr Company to manage its shipping terminal, which turned out to be a very successful long-term partnership. Also arriving in Richmond were the American Standard Company, the Standard Sanitary Company, the Stauffer Chemical Company, the Felice and Pirelli Canning Company, and many other job-creating enterprises. All in all, Richmond grew its commercial, industrial side with its civic cultural side very successfully for over 40 years. Then came World War II and the Kaiser shipyards. Richmond's leaders were experienced at running a quiet, conservative, small town. By 1940, the city manager had been in office for 20 years. The school superintendent had served since 1901, and the chief of police had been on the force since 1950. They were poorly prepared to deal with the crisis of growth coming their way. During the war years, from 1942 to 45, Kaiser estimated over 200,000 people came to and went from Richmond. The number did not include the dozens of ancillary businesses located in Richmond that produced products and services for Kaiser's new ships. At any given time, there were close to 100,000 men and women working in Richmond and trying to live here. People especially poured into Richmond in 42 and 43. These men and women and their families came from all across America, bringing their unique habits, customs, traditions, and prejudices with them, to the considerable consternation of Richmond's leaders. Immediately there was the huge problem of housing, because there simply was no housing. There were private homes, some apartments, and a few modest hotels, and some boarding houses. Up to that time, the city had needed no more than that. The two nicest hotels, the Don and the Mac, were not places an Arkansas shipyard worker and his family were likely to find shelter. People slept on the ground, in their cars, in trucks, in converted chicken coops, in tents, in cardboard boxes, in garages, and in some cases, a single bedroom that accommodated 3 men or 3 women sleeping in shifts. Many of these makeshift arrangements had no toilet facilities, no heating source, no electrical power, and no water. In this crisis, the newly created Richmond Housing Authority turned to the federal government to seek money to immediately build temporary worker housing. The money came from the 1940 Housing Defense Act. This joint effort resulted in the construction of 23,000 units of shipyard worker housing, the largest government housing project in the entire country, here in Richmond. The Housing Authority's buildings were 1- and 2-story and contained 2 to 8 units. To put that in perspective, while a war was going on, builders had to find 24,000 bathtubs, 48,000 sinks, 24,000 ice boxes, and 96,000 doors. The number of doors would have been larger if the units had the safety feature of a back door. Many did not. By the end of 1943, it was possible to drive the entire 3-mile length of Cutting Boulevard from San Pablo Avenue, near the city of El Cerrito, to Canal Boulevard in Point Richmond, and never be out of sight of war housing. The buildings were deliberately built to be temporary. Construction was fast and at times marginal, so much so that by the end of the war, some of the buildings, though by no means all, were already in poor shape. However, the construction of all those units greatly relieved the enormous pressure on the city. In 1942, a development was conceived of 806 units, half of which would be 2-unit single-story buildings, and the other half 4- and 6-unit 2-story buildings. The project was to be called Harbor Gate, and it was unique in that it would include a brand new elementary school, a grocery store with a cleaners and variety store, maintenance buildings, and an administrative building. It was regarded by the Richmond Housing Authority as an elite project. That's what the South Side looked like in 1942, and below is the start of construction of Harbor Gate. The south side of the city had been sparsely inhabited before the war and used for small crops and animal grazing. It was flat land all the way to the bay, so there were few obstacles to building a huge project like Harbor Gate. Construction went forward very quickly. As soon as units were completed, they were occupied. September 2nd, 1945, the Japanese signed their surrender and the war was over. Kaiser had experienced a slowdown in demand for its ships as the European war itself drew to a close, and success was being found in the Pacific theater of the war. Layoffs started in 1944 and increased as the year wore on. With the end of the war, tens of thousands of shipyard workers had their jobs terminated immediately. And although they had housing, they no longer had paychecks. An estimated 15 to 17,000 people promptly left Richmond to return to their original homes. The majority of black shipyard workers with their families, an estimated 13,000 people, chose to stay. However, this was not at all what city leaders expected or wanted. They had planned for the departure of all of the thousands of white and black tenants so Richmond could return to the small, principally white, conservatively managed city it had once been. That change was never to happen, and the city was left with the immense struggle of how to accommodate all of the people who wanted to stay in Richmond, many of whom were hardworking people just trying to make a place for themselves. But they were poor, or euphemistically called low income, not ideal Richmonders from the city's point of view. A 130-page post-war redevelopment plan was created, but not until 1954, 9 years after the war, and it was almost completely ignored. With the shipyards closed, all of shipyard worker housing was converted to low-income public housing. All of the units, still in good condition, now became available to rent by low-income families. The whole enterprise was reluctantly administered by the Richmond Housing Authority. That is Harbor Gate. That's the duplex we lived in. This was the school, the administration building, and the grocery store. No other of all the other developments, none had all these features. This change eventually drew my family to become renters in 1946 in a two-unit building in Richmond's Harbor Gate project. How did we find our family living in public housing in Richmond? In researching how folks migrated to the Kaiser shipyards, I found that the largest number were convinced to come by letters sent by people who were already active shipyard workers to relatives, friends, and neighbors back home. The letters extolled the good wages, working conditions, benefits, and housing. This recruitment method was far more successful than any of those tried by the Kaiser recruiters. Tens of thousands of people came to Richmond because of those letters. This is exactly what happened to our family in 1946, even though the shipyards were no longer employers. Two of my father's sisters, who had moved with their husbands to California to work in war-related industries, proclaimed the Bay Area was the place to be, and specifically Harbor Gate in Richmond because of the low rent and good living conditions. One of my dad's sisters was living in Harbor Gate when she wrote the letter. They urged my father to gather us up and join them. Mom and Dad were eventually persuaded, at least partly because they wanted to be near family. And as he always did, Dad first went to the Bay Area to get a job, and then we moved. When we arrived in Harbor Gate, our initial rent was $5 a week. To qualify, of course, you had to be poor, or again, more nicely put, low income. Many of the former shipyard workers qualified because most of them had lost their shipyard incomes and were now working at jobs that paid much less than they had previously earned. This was assuming, of course, that they had found jobs. Those who were not former shipyard workers qualified by having low-income blue-collar jobs. The Bro family, who occupied the other half of our duplex, was headed by Edmund Bro, who laid in the refinished hardwood floors. Cantarutti family, who lived across the court from us, was headed by Mr. Cantarutti, who worked for the Richmond Garbage Company. Further into the court was the Clark family, headed by Mr. Clark, who worked for a grocery store, and so on. All of these families had kids my age that I went to school with and with whom I played. A short departure. Less than a year after we arrived in Harborgate, one of my father's sisters returned to Oklahoma, and the other returned to Texas. So much for family. When we arrived in Richmond, the first thing my mother did was to get me and my sister registered in school. We transferred from Washington School, elementary school, to Harborgate Elementary School. The second thing she did was to enroll me in the Cub Scouts. I can only assume she saw joining the Scouts as a way for me to meet other boys and make friends in a new place. What she probably didn't fully realize was signing me up led to her having to take on the job of a den mower. The only significant thing I remember about being in Scouting was the tour that was arranged for us Harborgate Scouts of the Ford assembly plant. The Ford building is almost 1,000, whoops. Sorry. Got a little awry there, I'm sorry. Ford building is almost 1,000 feet long. I didn't know that then, but from a 10-year-old's perspective, the assembly line seemed to go on forever and ever. Watching the cars being put together was fascinating, but the big reward came when we saw the completed new Fords roll off the end of the assembly line. At that time, a brand new Ford cost $1,300, far more than any of our parents could afford. The Federal Housing Authority built new classrooms at schools all over Richmond to accommodate the huge influx of workers' children. The number of students counted in the 1944-45 school year was 28,851. That was 5,000 more than the entire population of Richmond in 4 years earlier. Even with the addition of many new classrooms, all schools were mandated to operate on double shifts. If you can believe it, Steege Elementary School had to operate on 4 shifts, each 2.5 hours long. In time, additional classrooms were built at Steege, and they too would go on a double shift. Double shifts were true of the brand new Harborgate Elementary when it opened in 1944. It was built to accommodate 500 students, but 850 showed up on the first day. However, by the time my sister and I arrived, the school was operating just 1 shift, and the class size was about 40 students. You will notice from the photographs that classes were integrated, although government housing was not. It was segregated. These photos are primarily, moving on. These photos are primarily here to show the Spartan nature of the homes behind the kids. You will note there are no trees, a reflection again of the intention that the homes be temporary. I should mention that the 2 boys standing with me were the Bro brothers, Ronnie and Eddie, in our scout outfits, my best friends and occupants with their parents of the other half of our duplex. A number of years after this picture was taken, the 3 of us would join the Marine Corp together, but that's another story. Also in the other photo is my sister Pat, who was 2 years younger than I was. Harborgate was a good place to live, with its population of low-income workers and families. We all dressed within our budgets, and there was no display of better-dressed kids or their parents. We all drove used cars, and with no exception that I can remember, we all drove just one. When you're a poor kid and everyone around you is poor and lives a life just like yours, you don't think of yourself as poor. It was just the way things were. All of that was to change for all poor kids with the arrival of television. But that too is another story. Another marker of being low income was the presence in every unit of an icebox. Anyone here had experience with iceboxes? Oh, see that? In the mid-30s, home refrigerators started to catch on. By the late 40s, half of American homes had refrigerators, and the number jumped dramatically every year. But no one had refrigerators in public housing. We had iceboxes. An ice truck working an established route would come by on a predetermined schedule and deliver ice to us. I think our icebox would hold a 25-pound block. The iceman would chip off a 25-pound block from a much bigger chunk of ice in his truck, would then carry it in and place it in our icebox. In the summertime, all of us kids chased the truck, hoping to get slivers of ice that might fall off the truck or persuade the iceman to give us a piece. The residents of every government housing unit in Richmond, all 23,000, followed this routine of icebox delivery. The Bros were the first family in our immediate neighborhood to get a TV. Black and white, of course. Unlike this picture, the screen was much smaller, but we all gathered around to watch with the same intensity as you see in this photo. Mr. and Mrs. Bro had 4 kids who loved watching TV, and fortunately for us, they were very tolerant about letting neighbor kids come over to watch with them. We all sat on the floor and even arrived early to watch the test screen because it was also new. In addition to riding our bikes everywhere, including the empty acres adjacent to Harbor Gate, playing pickup basketball games at the school and baseball games at Nickel Park, we had further entertainment in the form of kids' movies, which are shown in the small auditorium at the administration building every Saturday afternoon. These showings always included cartoons, even an episode of a serial, and then a longer adventure story with cowboys and Indians or kids doing grown-up things like flying a plane to save people in distress. Great fun. If you went out of Harbor Gate to seek entertainment, there were the movie theaters. During the war, there were 10 theaters along McDonald Avenue, and 4 more in surrounding communities. This photo shows the Fox Theater, halfway down the photo, and it seated 1,100 people. Across the street was the UA Theater that you can't see in the photo. That was almost as large. All the theaters were open 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. Tickets were about 25 cents. Before housing became available, it was not uncommon for a worker to buy a ticket, find a seat, and then sleep for a few hours. If you went to see a movie, you had to make sure you weren't seated too close to a snoring worker. Our family did not attend movies. We belonged to a fundamentalist church that viewed movies as sinful. However, I convinced my parents to make one exception for me in the case of Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. Because every single friend of mine was going to see it. So on a July day in 1948, we all went. I was 11. I had never been in a huge theater or experienced the fact that it was completely dark before the movie started. I can tell you now as an adult that I didn't see one bit of humor in that movie. I just saw the horror of Dracula, Frankenstein, and a werewolf. I remember how scared I was to this day. Needless to say, I didn't put any subsequent pressure on my parents to let me see more movies. While life moved on for our family, the future of Harbor Gate became the focus of the Richmond Housing Authority, the Richmond Redevelopment Agency, the Richmond City Council, and influential private interests, the movers and shakers I had mentioned earlier. Harbor Gate was regarded as one of Richmond's most successful wartime housing developments when it was planned, built, and occupied. But that was not enough to protect it from what was to come. Unknown to Harbor Gate residents, in addition to all the agencies mentioned above, there are two other significant enemies who are working to have the project demolished, one of whom would be successful. Senator William F. Nolan, who owned the Oakland Tribune newspaper, had apparently developed a relationship with the Equitable Life Insurance Company and the Stoneston brothers, financiers and builders of the Stonestown Galleria and the Stonestown apartments in San Francisco. In an effort to entice them to build in Richmond, he inserted a special amendment, Section 405 into Senate Housing Bill 349, providing language that would allow a developer to acquire the Harbor Gate land at the price the government had paid for it at the beginning of the war, which was 1/4 of what it was worth after the war. The Contra Costa County CIO Council called this amendment the $2,000 mink coat Nolan Amendment. $2,000 in 1951 was equivalent to $25,000 today. An expensive fur coat. The other enemy was a private citizen, Jack Greer, vice president of the Central Valley Bank of Richmond. He had heard from his financial sources that Safeway was looking for a new warehouse, and he did a new warehouse site. And he was determined it should be in Richmond. So he formed a Get Safeway committee with himself as chairman, and as members Forrest Simone, the city tax collector, Warren Brown Jr., publisher of the Richmond Independent newspaper, and William McNevin, president of the Richmond Motor Company. In time, they gained support from several key agencies and pushed for the demolition of Harbor Gate so Safeway could acquire enough land to build its warehouse. At the same time, Nolan was busy in Washington, and the Get Safeway Committee was busy in Richmond. The City Council and the Housing Authority were systematically forcing tenants to leave their units, and public housing was being torn down everywhere. There was a pattern of moving families who had nowhere else to go from the buildings they were in that were scheduled to be torn down to buildings not yet on the tear-down list. This was especially true of black families because there were no alternative places they could rent or buy in Richmond. And they did not want to return, many of them did not want to return to southern states many had come from. As one woman said, places where they had to step off the sidewalk if a white person was walking toward them. Federal lenders like the FHA, Federal Housing Authority, and the VA, Veterans Administration, through the GI Bill, would not guarantee mortgages for blacks, only whites. The FHA had developed in 1934 and the VA in 1944 were racist institutions from the day they were created. Apparently, President Roosevelt needed Southern votes to pass the FHA loan guarantee legislation, and Southern congressmen agreed to give their support provided loan guarantees were not given to Negroes. When the GI Bill was established, the language called for its benefits to be for all veterans. But the practical fact was systematic exclusion of black veterans in job training, education, housing, and even unemployment. It was not until 1968 that this changed, and the FHA and the VA were finally forced to guarantee loans solely on the basis of ability to pay. A decades-long economic gap that black families are still trying to overcome today. In Richmond, an active black resistance formed to confront the decisions Richmond authorities were making. The first NAACP chapter in the East Bay was formed in Harbor Gate. In spite of demonstrations and even appeals to Sacramento and Washington, the destruction continued. Ultimately, only 3 housing projects were designated to survive: Atchison Village, Neestrom Village, and the Triangle Court homes. The first government housing, Atchison Village, was actually the first government housing to be built. It was started in 1941 and completed in 1942. It is my understanding, though documents are scarce, that Atchison was initially designed to serve the housing needs of managers, supervisors, engineers, and other white-collar employees of the very first Kaiser shipyard. This was before the war had been declared. Kaiser had won a contract to build 31 cargo ships for Great Britain and started hiring skilled people immediately. Atchison Village was designed by Carl Warnecke. Let's go back to it. It consisted of 450 units that were built of good materials, had sloping roofs, good siding, and full perimeter foundations. It was without doubt the best constructed of all the thousands of units subsequently built. After the war, and after much debate about preserving Atchison Village as low-income housing, the City Council changed course and in 1957 sold the property to a corporation created by the people who were living in the village. Thus ended its tenure as low-income public housing, and at the same time satisfying the racial concerns of some members of Richmond's leadership, as evidenced by a statement made by chiropractor Dr. Amos B. Hinckley, chairman of the Richmond Housing Authority, at an open meeting on July 2nd, 1953. If Atchison Village becomes low rent, it will be immediately overrun by a certain group. He didn't have to define a certain group. It's hard to know why Neestrom Village and the Triangle Court homes were saved. The construction of the Neestrom units and the Triangle units were very much like Harbor Gates, but the developments were very much smaller. Only 102 units at Neestrom and 90 units at Triangle. The Triangle homes were later completely rebuilt and continue as low-income housing. Money was spent at Neestrom to improve the interior of the units, and it continues to this day as public housing. However, the city seems to be letting it deteriorate while they figure out who they should hire to build replacement housing. Some vacant units are now boarded up, exterior painting is peeling, and the landscaping is being neglected. It is a blight on the whole neighborhood and a real failure of Richmond's leadership. Just my opinion, of course. During and after the war, black families were socially barred from buying homes in the city of Richmond. Some found places to live in Berkeley and in Oakland, but many were forced to return to the unincorporated area of North Richmond, where they could rent, buy, or build. North Richmond had been a traditional area of black settlement because black families were simply not welcome in the city. There was one major exception to this. In 1949, the Reverend Guthrie John Williams and the Reverend Moses Bradford, both forces in Richmond's political circles, were able to secure a meeting with Fred Parr, a wealthy white real estate developer and manager of the city's shipping terminals. The meeting was scheduled for 20 minutes, and it went on for 4 hours, during which the reverends explained in detail the plight of black Richmonders in jobs and housing. The result of the meeting was an agreement by Mr. Parr to build 400 homes on 67 acres of land he owned on the northwest side of Richmond. The new subdivision was called Barchester Village, and it would be the first in the state to sell to black buyers. Apparently, he arranged for mortgage financing independent of the FHA. The project was to be for all Americans. However, when white families realized Parkchester Village was to be an integrated community, most decided not to buy, so Parkchester became a dominantly black development. It is still an active community today. In 1953, Richmond authorities went to Washington to ask that 25 units of vacant housing be demolished. They were still destroying it. And money granted for the construction of 300 units of low-income housing at a site known as Easter Hill. The 2,500 units were demolished, and in 1954, Easter Hill Village was built. It was like much of the shipyard worker housing that preceded it. It was a puny effort, my words, because the Housing Authority only built 67 units. With the sale of Atchison Village to its residents, Richmond was left with only 259 low-income rental units, where 23,000 had existed before. Richmond leaders clearly had no empathy for low-income folks. While these events were taking place, there was a fateful decision made that would impact our family and all Harbor Gate tenants. Safeway announced that it was willing to build in Richmond. However, the available vacant land was not large enough for Safeway's construction needs. So Richmond leaders agreed to demolish all of Harbor Gate to create an adequate site for Safeway's new warehouse and the 600 jobs that would come with it. There was no real willingness among Richmond's leaders to preserve public housing, in spite of the obvious need for it. And there was a strong desire to make all of the South Side an industrial zone. The decision having been made, the eviction notices immediately started being issued. Because there had been so much tenant unrest brought on by the uncertainties of Harbor Gate's future, the Housing Authority didn't initiate a mass eviction. Instead, its leadership cleverly notified small groups of tenants that they had to leave. In doing so, they avoided demonstrations and possible riots. At some point, our family received our eviction notice, and we were forced to leave too. This was true of all of our neighbors. The buildings were vacated, as you see here, and torn down along with Harbor Gate School, the administration building, the maintenance building, and the Harbor Gate grocery store. The destruction and removal were so total that I can't find a single trace of Harbor Gate